My name is Max Gagliardi, and we're here live on Memorial Day, May 30th, 2022, with David Heikkinen. And first, we want to say that this episode is brought to you by Blockware Solutions. If you're interested in Bitcoin mining, you can visit blockwaresolutions.com/energy and get in contact with Blockware. They have experience going back to 2013 and can provide new and used ASICs. They've done over 250,000 ASIC unit sales and have mined over 1,000 Bitcoin in the Blockware pool. David, how are you doing on this Memorial Day?
Hey, everybody. Yeah, I'm here.
Sorry.
No worries. Happy Memorial Day. And just thinking about all the veterans and very, very grateful. Always think of my dad, my uncle, grandfathers. It's just a wild thing to think about serving cousins and the like. So thank you all. Put on my American League Astros shirt to proudly be an American today. So no, things are going pretty good. I actually checked out your Blockware Solutions. I'm actually considering putting my own mine in just to get the actual experience. I always say you got to have skin in the game to understand something. So I would recommend. It seemed pretty straightforward. I just got to figure out economics of it, and we can talk about that offline. As far as like where you put things and reliable power pricing and that type of thing. But yeah, prices are down. Bitcoin's down.
Today they bumped a little bit. We had an interesting negative difficulty adjustment this last one, which is a welcome surprise. I think it was like around 4.5%, which means it got easier to mine. I don't know if that's like any hint of capitulation in the mining side of things. We'll see. Probably not. You do see random variance where it goes down and up, but yeah, Blockware, they make it easy, and they can either do hosting and they just announced a new facility this week. And I don't know all the details. I'm happy for those guys. I think they've got a good track record. Their new facility is going to have some solar interconnect to it, so I know they kind of touted a little bit of that as well. But it is on grid. I believe it's in Kentucky, so fairly safe political environment. Kentucky's really embraced mining, so yeah, go check those guys out. But real quick on Memorial Day, I know you already hit on it, and maybe we'll just start there because it's the top of the mind. But yeah, like my grandpa fought in Korea. My great-grandfather, his dad, fought in World War I, couldn't even speak English, came over and got sent back and fought and then came back to the U.S. And then my wife's grandfather, was in World War II and was a paratrooper in the Pacific, getting dropped behind enemy lines every time they would storm an island. So probably one of the more terrifying roles that you could have. And a really interesting story that I'll tell about him is that he had like a real life Saving Private Ryan moment where his father passed away and he was the only son of the family, and his mom wrote a letter to the president and the president responded and they got him out because he would basically be the breadwinner. They still have like the letter framed to this day.
Wow.
It's kind of a crazy story back from the president. So just grandfathers, it seems like we're cut from a different cloth. We made a joke about it the other day. My wife and I, we were talking about grandpas, and we were just like, holy cow, they were just cut from such a different time period and the things they had to go through.
No, this gets to our 100 years back, 100 years forward discussion we had the last time. But no, like my grandpa in the Great Depression, actually before going to serve on my paternal grandfather, swam across the Columbia River while he was hoboing to find a job, and got halfway across on a bet and realized that he wasn't going to be able to get the energy to swim back to collect on the bet. Like, I mean, just think about like the Columbia River is like the Mississippi, like back in then before it was dammed, and it's just it's a wild thought to swim across a freezing cold river. And my other grandfather, it's interesting here. Grandpa Grable was a master sergeant and served in Southeast Asia as well, and then was a drill sergeant. And so he was a tough son of a gun by all means, shapes, and form. I don't know how my kids would actually interface with him at this point as I think about it. He was a pretty tough guy. He wouldn't take any gruff from anybody. But yeah, it's definitely a different cloth or different times. And it just says like the resilience of people, of what you can live through and what you can get through. I think we've all had some resilient moments in the last few years. So it's just one day at a time. But what was interesting, you were just talking about the book you're reading. I thought maybe we could talk about that, and that would actually segue into the work that I'm doing as well. So your Bhakta Smil comments might be interesting for people.
Well, first, Vaclav Smil is amazing, and he's just such a
Mm-hmm.
great thinker in this space. I think he's probably one of the world's, if not the world expert around energy, and he's written books on energy and engineering and science. I think he's got something like 40 books, and these aren't short books either. He's written extremely well thought out books around energy, and he's been a big proponent of realistic goals in terms of the energy transitions. He's written a whole book on the history of energy transitions and how they've happened and how humans have evolved. It's extremely interesting. And he talks about just all these different complex systems, and he tries to boil them down. And he's very numbers based. So he
Mm-hmm.
looks at things like in his recent book, which is to me kind of a compilation of a lot of his thoughts over the years. He's getting older. Tried to get him on the podcast. He has a publisher. I've hit them up a couple times. I haven't heard back, but he's getting up there in age. I don't know how much public speaking he's doing these days, although I've seen some over the last couple years. But he really tries to break it down by the numbers. He loves talking about joules. He loves talking about the raw energy, and then does a lot of conversions in his books,
Mm-hmm.
kind of trying to normalize energy usage across different things. And like in his recent book, he talks about agriculture a lot, and I think he uses the phrase like a fossil food society, and it's like he talks about the amount of hydrocarbons, and he breaks it down into oil, the equivalent oil energy, and he says like for a loaf of bread, it's this many teaspoons worth of oil, worth of energy that went into that for this type of, and he breaks down all these different types of food and the amount of energy and how that food is actually made and the history of how we got better at creating different types of food, breaks it down by the different categories and what specific energy usage that we've done in each one of those categories. This is extremely fascinating. But he does talk about the carbon capturing potential of plants and of root systems. And there are some things that would be kind of the holy grail in terms of removing carbon from the atmosphere if we were to get more sophisticated around those sciences. And I know that you've been doing some work in that space, and it's just incredibly fascinating to me because I think the way he's framed it is that it would be better for agriculture and ultimately humanity, right? That we could have more resilient crops, but then also it could help decarbonize the atmosphere. So it gets back to one of these kind of like free market solutions that is just kind of brilliant. It can check a lot of boxes and make people's lives better while also reducing carbon footprint. So it's a really interesting topic to me.
Yeah, it's the thing I'm working on is really it's gigatons of carbon capture capacity on an annual basis in existing supply chains of how we already grow plants and foods, and it's really around wetland, rangeland, and grassland preservation as well. And so it's a remarkable and super cool thing. It's called the Harnessing Plants Initiative with the Salk Institute. And I'm just a small cog financial analyst in the machine, but as I've learned more about it, there's some really simple things, but the two heads of the initiative, actually, Joanne did a TED talk and won the TED Audacious Prize a few years ago. And so you can watch that, just search Harnessing Plants Initiative. And, she's remarkable. She unfortunately has Parkinson's disease as well. And so has this real tangible grasp on trying to get something done, quickly that'll have a long-term impact. Jeff Bezos and Hess and Sempra, I think, have also funded the initiative, but they've developed essentially multiple plant lines that genetically engineered for the roots to grow deeper, thicker, and have more carbon content or more cork. It's this remarkable chemical called suberin. It's like, a few years ago, every year Time magazine has a cover of like, what was it? DHA in plastics was the chemical that was a negative, and then you had THC. And at some point in the future, I think suberin will be something that everybody in the world knows about, because what it essentially is going to do is the first 10 centimeters of soil has decades of carbon turnover. The next 10 centimeters has centuries of carbon turnover. And then you get the next 10 to 50 centimeters. So now you're talking just 30 to, you've dug a hole this deep, has carbon capacity that is in the hundreds of years. And so essentially you're building hundreds of years of soil replenishing plants with essentially in the existing soybean or, crop planting cycle. And so And then you think about that, you can take it globally. So you're not changing anything. Like as long as so you have two parts of a plant. You have the shoot, which is what's above the ground, and you have the root, which is what's below the ground. As long as the shoot still produces what you want or more, and then the root puts more carbon into the ground, you're actually even getting a benefit of soil replenishment. And so the remarkable thing when I thought about what I wanted to work on next, and I kind of put things in scale and concept, you hear a lot about direct air capture. Well, the reality is every single plant has hundreds of millions of years of evolution of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and figuring out how to grow and make its progeny, grow well as well. And so then you take another step back. I don't know if you ever composted before, but like the blackest, darkest soil is the best. And that is because it has a high degree of carbon and nitrogen in it. And so not only are you taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, putting it into centuries of carbon capture, but you're actually also replenishing the soil and actually improving soils potentially as well. And so you're actually solving two of the world's problems, one of climate and one of food scarcity simultaneously in this concept. And it is amazingly cool. And so that's where I'm spending my time.
Well, I love the two. We'll talk about the two different separate issues. So you've got, CO2 that's building up in the atmosphere. We're, as a species, releasing more CO2 because we're, harnessing ancient solar power in the form of carbon-based life forms. And then we're, repurposing that into energy that we can use to power the modern world, which is also accelerating the amount of CO2 that you would see that would, be coming up out of the ground naturally in the system. On the other hand, you've got, and so this is, we're seeing, warming patterns, obviously, since, they've got plenty of studies out there that show that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. So this is a problem. To the extent of the problem and the different types of solutions, I think that's really where the interesting part of the debate is, right? Like, what do we do? How big of a problem is this? What are ways to do to fix this over time that don't impact people today? So that's an extremely important problem that people are trying to solve.
Yeah, exactly. And the carbon hydrogen bond is a super efficient way to have durable energy storage and transportation. And so the reality is you don't want to have to change everything to solve problems. And so like capitalism will work. Like if these seeds end up being, as good or better, they'll just become part of the traits of every seed that gets planted in the world. The other thing that is amazing is they've done a lot of work on wetlands restoration, which is already something that needs to happen. And so you think you've ever seen a mangrove forest, but like imagine how thick those roots are. They have 10 to 20 times the storage capacity of soil from a carbon standpoint. But really what you're going to have happen is these adjacencies that are beneficial of, if you're building an LNG facility like Venture Global did, and they had 360 acres of wetlands that they disturbed, imagine, replenishing, multiples of that, and having, more stable wetlands in South Louisiana. And so you're going to get both the carbon credit, but you're also stabilizing the wetlands around your facility for more durability against any of the hurricanes that come. And then finally, the fisheries actually improve. You start actually seeing this side benefit of shrimping and fishing improve as well. And I worked offshore, and I was kind of putting things in perspective of whenever I started thinking about gigatons of carbon capture factories in in the wetlands of South Louisiana is what I'd love to see happen. And what I mean by that is you're just going to plant a bunch of trees and cattails that have better root systems that capture more CO2. But the biggest facility I ever worked on was a 100,000 barrel a day facility. And what was amazing is you fish those facilities. And so the structure is a natural reef, but I started thinking in perspective. So 100,000 barrels a day, if an entire year of that production was 8 hours of global oil demand, and like the amount of time and energy that we put into that. And then I took another step back when I started thinking about the scale of the work that everybody does in the oil business. And, we covered about 9 million barrels a day from Exxon and Chevron down to the little companies. So you think about that 9 out of 100, essentially that's 2 hours and 10 minutes of daily global demand that we covered in all of the integrated oil companies at Heikkinen Energy Advisors and PEP Insights now, and EOG and Hess and Oxy, all the way down to the little companies. It's 2 hours and 10 minutes. And so like the scale now of having an impact that is potentially global is really, really interesting to me. And that's the thing of that people forget about the fossil industry is it is a depleting asset. And so like it's capital intensive and depleting and requires a lot of cycle. It's not going to go away, I don't believe. And so let's figure out other solutions to have an offset to the stock of what's in the atmosphere. And if these genius future Nobel laureates at the Salk Institute have come up with something that can work, there's other ideas out there as well. I mean, so you have biofuels, you have a lot of other things that are using the fiber off the surface, the leftovers on plants. Like we covered a great company in Viva that is taking timber byproducts and making it into wood pellets to supplement and replace coal-fired power plants, and that those side things are carbon neutral fuels, and I think they matter as well. So it's an interesting thing. So like the reality of where the world is right now is needs smart people thinking about all these solutions. But really what I think the bigger part of the Salk folks is that they can feed people as well. And so you start thinking about solving the food scarcity crisis, and if the soils get replenished, you need less fertilizer. More nitrogen, and plants by definition are live in one place for their entire life, and so there's a little bit of what's called exudate, that is they exclude carbon into the soil. It's kind of this slimy stuff on the roots of plants. They're trying to essentially improve their environment so the next plant that grows there's going to be better. And so it's like hundreds and hundreds of millions of years of evolution to try to survive and thrive with just a little bit of tweaking. If that can remarkably help the climate as well, it's just pure genius.
Yeah, I think the part that was the second part of it was that if it can reduce the dependence on hydrocarbon-based fertilizers, then that's a huge win too, because you're getting it coming and going. You're on the front end, capturing more carbon, but then you're also over time replenishing the soil in a way to where it reduces the need for ammonia-based fertilizers and all the different things that they have to do. And there's a lot that goes into agriculture. They have to monitor the soil, and over time, there's a real science to it. But today, it requires large-scale inputs from fossil fuels, and to any extent that you can reduce that, it could help solve hunger and food problems around the world. So it's just got this really powerful narrative to it. What would you go ahead on that? And then I got one more for you.
No, I think the thing that is remarkable about agriculture and energy, the two things now I've spent some time on, both are critical for life, but also very marginal enterprises. Like a lot of your dollar per acre yields can be very, very narrow. And so it's just a really interesting kind of fit together of the energy sector. Obviously, we went to negative pricing a couple of years ago, and really op margins and return on capital has been below the cost of capital for sure for until the last couple of years. We're actually making a lot of that up right now, and so the plug for the oil and gas space is they're actually having a catch up couple of years, which will improve things. And I do think it puts the energy space in probably the most advantaged ESG position, because I always say this is we in the oil and gas space thought about the environmental impacts, the social impacts, and governance is starting to improve. But because we've been thinking about it for so long, we're way ahead of like the tech sector or the retail sector that they're going to come after next. Whenever you start thinking about the full impact of ESG, and that Tesla getting dropped from some indices kind of made me laugh. They have like the worst social and the worst governance I've probably ever seen. A great stock over time and great company, but like not a great ESG company by any means. And so that just is an interesting thing. So then you roll that forward into the ag space. Imagine now layering in some carbon tax credits on the most marginal lands in the world. Like, so essentially, some of these properties have, single digit to low, like call it $5 to $20 an acre yields. If you're able to put, 5-6 tons of carbon in each hectare, you can actually start really impacting farmers' economics as well, beyond what, effectively the shoot has value and then the root has value. And that just changes the profile of some pretty interesting lands that are not the best, farmland, but definitely could be way much more economic. And so you're really going to start, having impacts on, the poorest of the people that have the poorest quality land. So you really start seeing some environmental justice uplift as well. And so it's like this, all of these side benefits just keep laying on top of each other. The other company that I'm still working with is CarbonVert, and they just did the sell down to Chevron. So they're a geologic carbon capture company that's working on the flow of carbon into the atmosphere. And the Talos and CarbonVert folks, took a leap of faith and bid, on the first Texas General Land Office lease, and really moved it forward, and just monetized half of it to Chevron. And so, got multiples of return, but really de-risked it. And now we'll have probably the first real, on a global scale, it's probably the best project that I've seen, both from the standpoint of how the Texas General Land Office was forward thinking on long dated monitoring and the observation of that. And then really having Chevron, Talos, and CarbonVert in the project to advance it forward. You have deep pocket emitter. You have a great operator that's put in platforms and drilled wells, and then you have a great company at permitting and tax equity monetization. And so these little companies that are springing up in and around it, they're going to actually really create a ton of value. And the reason it creates value is there is the other side of the market, like the voluntary markets. Microsoft has a lot of emissions, Amazon has a lot of emissions, and so they're trying to figure out ways. Amazon can't stop flying things around, so the reality is that they've got to find a way to get an offset to that, and it's companies that are going to be putting carbon in the ground will provide them a way to offset their aviation, so everybody can still use Amazon Prime, like I know we all do. I bet we'll probably get 3 packages this week. So it's this overlay of 2 perfect worlds of geologic capture and ag-based capture that I'm sitting in this really unique seat to observe both, and I hope I can get them to overlay, because it's the energy business and the climate business typically are at odds, but from my seat they're actually very much aligned, and could be very, very value creative.
Right. Now there's this amazing stat, and you kind of alluded to it through some tweets you did the other day, and then I think I pulled the slide from, I believe Toby Rice put together. He's kind of been on fire lately with promoting natural gas. He's kind of stepping into Aubrey McClendon's footprints around promoting natural gas. But that stat that you can basically, if we were to decommission the coal plants around the world and switch them to LNG, you could reduce more CO2 than all the cars on the road in the U.S. You could basically be the equivalent of electrifying all of them. Plus, it'd be the equivalent of putting rooftop solar on every home in America. Plus, it would be the equivalent of 57,000 windmills that are wind turbines that have been installed. So, the pushback to that generally comes down to 2 things. One is that it still creates CO2, and then the second is methane leaks. And I think through incentives, we've already seen methane leaks coming way down. I mean, like Presidio had their CEO on, and he said that they have a bond that has a green portion tied to it. And so it's the capital markets incentivizing them to reduce methane leaks. And I think they had something like 3 or 4 years to reduce 50% of the methane leaks on their sites. They're going to get it done in like a year or 2. Basically they're going to get it done rapidly. He's like, this is something we have the capability to do. We're now incentivized to do so through the capital markets. It's going to reduce our borrowing costs. It's a free market way to reduce emissions, and methane's a potent one. Then you talk about the CO2 side, and if you're doing large scale facilities like power generation, that's really the use case for capture and sequestration. I mean, it gets very difficult. You can't capture, every single car's emissions unless they're all electric, and then maybe you could. But we're seeing now the supply chain challenges, the minerals and mining challenges to electrifying everything. But if you could, start by converting power gen, getting rid of coal, converting it to nat gas, and then also, introducing capture and sequestration through incentives, you could get a long ways there. And I think that, focusing on solutions where there's really not that much new tech involved. I mean, sure, there needs to be some on the capture and sequestration side, and obviously new infrastructure built, but we're not having to reinvent the wheel. We know that there's geological formations you can put the carbon back into. We know that we can, capture it and put it into pipelines. It's just midstream. And so looking at solutions where you say, this is something that could be done rapidly. It's something that could be done without a bunch of new tech, and it could be done through incentives. And maybe part of it's, top down, but maybe part of it's just natural market incentives. Like you said, I mean, if it's an Amazon and they want to buy offsets, then go partner with a carbon capture company and do it that way, to where it's the markets working together. Those are things that get me excited whenever you start to talk about the different solutions for some of these energy problems.
No, I mean, we did some work, and I'm looking forward to the BP statistical review coming out, and within the next month. Actually, it's pretty soon, because they catch up so much data. And I'm just curious what the 2021 data is going to look like versus 2020, because I posted something that, my lifetime, we're essentially back, the US is back to the same level of emissions that it had whenever I was born. And, the trend of improvement is meaningful. And I really do think natural gas played a big role in that. And, the emissions problems are essentially, you can solve 80% of the emissions with 20% of effectively you're talking about pneumatics and flaring, and then monitoring for leaks. And at Texoga, one of the things that we did was they have effectively just simple cameras that are catching and identifying methane via infrared, and they just see leaks faster, and they're not expensive. And so like the drone flyover ideas, like there's just so many low dollar opportunities that are happening in and around the oil and gas space to just make it cleaner. And I keep advocating that the U.S., Norway, and Canada are three of the cleanest countries in the world producing hydrocarbons, and all three countries have federal governments that are not favorable towards hydrocarbon production. And every time we stop trying to produce here, we're essentially offloading that to a dirtier place. And if anything, we have the incentives here that are actually going to, lead to how the world can actually produce over time, and lead the technology development that then will be deployed in other parts of the world for hopefully a lower cost. And so it's like this, let us lead, let the oil and gas sector lead, let companies that are in the oil and gas sector work on geologic carbon capture, let them accelerate it. We need faster EPA permits for injection wells. That just needs to be debottlenecked. And what is interesting, I'm keenly interested in kind of the reviving of what Manchin's going to put forward, because I do believe one of the things that could be in there is better and higher dollar value 45Q credits. And if that happens, man, I'm telling you, it will be, the US will revolutionize how much CO2 can be caught in the flow side. And I do think direct air capture will move forward as well. There's some really interesting things around kind of waste heat use, because the problem on direct air capture is you have to break the CO2 off the catalyst again, and so you need heat. Well, there's actually some thoughts of combining that with nuclear capacity. Waste heat off nuclear plants that are essentially there, for that breaking the catalyst. So effectively, nuclear combined with CCUS is a pretty interesting idea. The other thing that people don't bring up on the flow side of capture, one of the things that I've learned is the Netherlands is one of the largest food producers in Europe. A lot of it is vertical farming, and one of the things that is happening is they're actually capturing CO2 off some facilities, and then they increase the CO2 inside the buildings because it makes the plants grow better. And so it's like this cycle of opportunity of kind of letting nature consume carbon dioxide, and improving yields and doing it in better economic ways. And then each side gets the benefit of that cleaner product, and you have a better plant yield. And so it's just interesting Whenever I hear like big machines being built don't need to happen whenever we've got big trees and, forests and cropland that are just sitting there waiting to be natural carbon sinks. So
Really cool. A couple of points that you hit on. A really cool idea, and guys like Alex Epstein have pushed this in his old book. I don't in the Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. I don't know if it's in his new one. I'm reading his new one now. I'm about 2 chapters in, but he talks about how the wealthier countries, because of the fact that they have access to cheap and abundant hydrocarbons, can then focus on cleaning things up. And I think that if you look at this U.S. story, like you mentioned, where things are trending better and trending way better, what we've seen is that you have the wealth, and then through the wealth, you created that through these cheap energy, and then you can focus more on the existential things, the things that are at the top of the pyramid, that are future projections or future problems, versus focusing on the bottom of Maslow's pyramid, where you got to take care of yourself today. I think this idea that if you could look at the world's issues and say, okay, what can we do? Kind of just this broad brush approach where everybody's got to, all these third world countries, they can't have the things that we have. They can't have access to cheap hydrocarbons. They've got to clean themselves up now. Like, that's not going to work. So get people on a path to where they can have access to good and abundant, reliable energy, cheap energy. And then through that process, through the economics of getting them that, use incentives in there to then make it cleaner and better. And that's what the U.S. is doing, and what some of these other countries are doing. The countries that aren't doing that are the ones that unfortunately, there's a lot of other countries that produce a lot of energy that aren't doing that. But I think that the U.S. has to lead the way. So it's really cool. And then you talk about efficiencies, like the heat capture thing is really interesting to me. And I love that theme because it's, I'm not an engineer and I didn't take thermodynamics, but I quote like the rules of it because people always talk about it. But this idea that energy can't be lost, it's just transferred. And then, the fact that you've got all this heat. And one really cool application that we've been talking to a couple of different companies lately that do heat capture to electricity generation. And, we looked at what that costs and then the different applications of where you can apply it. And so something as simple as like a 3606, which is like a compressor out in the oil field, there's thousands of them across the U.S. You can generate about 40 to 75 kilowatts of power off of those. And the reason why it fluctuates is because of like the ambient temperature. And so what you could do is you could, convert that to electricity, that heat capture, just through a heat exchanger, run it through a boiler that uses a special type of liquid that, boils a little bit lower temperature. And you can convert it to electricity. You can push some towards the grid, or you could use some to power, on-site applications. The one I'm thinking of, obviously Bitcoin mining is a really interesting application because it's a little bit more money up front. It's about double the cost of buying like a generator, but the fuel is effectively free for the life of the project. You're just using waste. And so, or your point around nuclear, like how do we pair these technologies together to where you can find a way to make the whole stack more efficient? And those are things that are just super exciting. And it just seems very futuristic, right? Like harnessing these different types of energies and using them. It's pretty cool thought exercises.
Yeah, the first principle of all work turns into either heat or shaft work. Like that's everything that happens in the world is either heat or shaft work. That's like basic mechanical engineering 101. But that waste heat is and really internal combustion engines have a tremendous amount of waste heat. That's why you have combined cycle gas turbines. Like essentially you're trying to catch as much of the energy in the process. And we did that with some compressors offshore, a long time ago, because it's just in a confined environment, you need to actually figure out ways to utilize everything. That waste heat actually, can go into process heat, at relatively low temperatures, but it actually helped with some water oil separation. So it's just little simple things like that of trying to conserve and be more efficient is a simple and really good option. It's going to be interesting to watch what happens this summer. I'm just curious, what else are you thinking about as we go through and really are kicking off summer with Memorial Day weekend?
I mean, personally, thinking about some trips we want to do. We're looking at we got a camper, got a little Airstream and pulling it around, trying to get more ambitious. I tweeted about going across the U.S. It might not be our first trip. We may do like a week trip. Maybe something we're looking at like some spots in Arkansas, maybe then working our way down to the Gulf. There's some spots in Alabama that are pretty cool that you can pull up and get some decent beach. And it's a relatively easier drive for us to where we could dip our toes in staying in the camper and maybe do like a 5-day trip or a 6-day trip instead of a 2-week trip, which maybe next year when we don't have 2 toddlers might be a little easier to do. So things like that. And then on the work side, I've just been, and we've talked about it a bunch, but just it's the natural gas story is the biggest story to me. I mean, oil is a little more clear cut, but nat gas has had a lot of my attention. It's just surreal still. It's good for what I do. It's good for our clients. Yeah, I don't know how long it's going to last, but it's been just a wild year on that front for my career. I mean, that's just been something that every day I'm looking at it. Every day I'm thinking about it, reading what I can, just because it's just so interesting to me. This just crazy rise we've seen in prices and what's going to play out the rest of the summer and then the rest of the year this year.
What are your thoughts, if you have any, on what's driven up the rally through, what typically would be a weak season? So
yeah, it's interesting. I want to do a TikTok.
What are people saying?
Yeah, I want to do a TikTok. I've thought about doing like a 2-minute kind of short video where I just boil down all my thoughts. So maybe I'll practice here. But, I think it's just this, the big story to me was 2 things. It's LNG capacity, and then it's the loss of associated gas. And then you combine that with maybe some of the infrastructure story around infrastructure getting built and supply chains. I think the supply chain stuff is short term, and the lack of workers and labor and all these things, the cost of, just regular casing pipe, it's just ridiculous. I have a lot of friends that do like marginal production just to get, things that you need to keep a well going. Costs have risen exponentially in a huge way. And then you've got labor shortages, et cetera. Really proud of a buddy of mine. They got a workover rig going and they were able to secure it and get it going on a project that they recently took down, and I've been happy for them. But now they're running into issues where they got the production getting curtailed by their facility sizes. So they've got to now figure out how to solve some of those problems. So things like that will get solved. But the big thing is LNG continuing to grow, looking at the looming projects on the horizon and seeing how much total gas that is, and then thinking about where those reserves are going to come from, and then coupling that with the loss of associated gas, which will come back with oil at these prices. I think in some ways, if oil prices were to dip, and let's say we got back down to $70 a barrel, or we had a pullback, and it really kind of reinforced this capital discipline mindset, and guys really, stuck with their strategy now and kind of entrenched themselves in being very disciplined, versus if we see a spike up in prices where oil gets to 140, 150 or some higher number, will guys be able to hold it back? I don't think guys are going to drill at those prices. And so the nat gas side of it, there's a lot of gas that comes with oil drilling. And so that decline hasn't sprung back as much as it was pre-COVID. So I think that combined with the new LNG are the main drivers in the near term. Obviously what's happening in Europe is kind of, we preached about the global connectivity of the market. Well, it's here. I mean, not fully, but it's definitely, rising tide lifts all ships type of scenario. So I don't know. We've underperformed on production to where people thought we could be. And then we're just, demand is continuing to go up. And that's always been my thesis with natural gas long term, was that I was just like, this demand is just there's an ocean of demand for this product. Natural gas is such a great product. And so can it continue to grow? And if it does, we got to continue to put supply online. So we'll see. I think those are the big pieces to the story, but what are your thoughts, or what did I leave out?
I mean, really the only thing that in the very near term, I'm just trying to figure out where the weather is going to be and kind of what ends up happening. But the issue is that we continue to see inventories draw down, not on gas, but like all inventories. We've had this kind of global destocking because of the shape of the curve, and it's setting itself up to any sort of adverse move on hot summer or cold winter. Some of the strategic use of our fuel oil inventories or the SPR release, or we're actually making things potentially tighter into an improving economic demand, inflationary. Like it's just like you've got this maybe a slowing of inflation, possibly, and then maybe we avoid the deep recession. I think we still go into some recession, but like we're in this very precarious setup, and I think that the commodities are just pricing in, where volatility could be, and so and that volatility is to the upside, not the downside, on both supply and demand. And so Yeah, the long dated demand story is as strong as I think I've ever seen. Both Senator from Alaska and EQT are doing a good job of kind of preaching where gas and LNG can be. And what's so cool to me is you're seeing like the geopolitical um, kind of reunification of democracies. And what I mean by that is, so now Israel exports gas into Egypt that goes into LNG that then goes into Europe. Like that binds Israel and Egypt and Europe together for a long period of time. The U.S. exports more into Europe and into Asia still. Like that, those economic bounds are things that last, and they just make the world a more stable place. So that's what gets me excited about hydrocarbons actually securing kind of geopolitical tensions. Whenever you have kind of the 30% of the world that is in the West, from a population standpoint, it just feels like that is aligning more directly, and that's a good thing, I think, for geopolitics. We'll see. I mean, I really do think that the big question is going to be, pipeline capacity and what ends up happening there. You've seen proposed pipelines out of West Texas, which is a huge benefit because that's really where the associated gas is going to come from.
Right.
And we might avoid some of the real bottlenecks that were going to be there in 2023, 2024, 2025. But now effectively we've got pipelines being underwritten by upstream companies that have a lot of associated gas volumes. So that actually makes me feel a little bit better about the supply side, because the Permian and the Eagle Ford are two of the areas that could be, the next biggest gas producing basins in the world, really. So
yeah, definitely. All right, well, we're getting a little long here. I want to talk some about this kind of Stoic thinking and some of these. You passed on some books. You had me read Ryan Holiday's Courage is Calling, which is definitely one that is top of mind on Memorial Day in terms of the courage that people have had to put forward to fight in these wars, and the courage of the people of Ukraine, the people that are fighting today. And so you think about that book, and that got me kind of hooked on Ryan Holiday. And I didn't know what to think about the guy at first. When I first kind of researched his background, and I could not have been more pleasantly surprised. I mean, he's done a really good job of two things, in my opinion. He's done really good at reading a lot of biographies. He seems to be, all of his books, he ties it back to historical people and their lives and what they've done. And that's very fascinating to me. It's hard for me to read biographies because it's like one person's life and it's just so much to dedicate for a single book. And so I struggle to get through them sometimes, but I love stories of people. And he does a great job distilling those down and pulling the lessons out of them. And then the other thing I think he's done a great job of is he's really gone into the Stoicism rabbit hole and looked back at some of the great thinkers in Greek history. If anybody that hasn't, if you're interested in history at all, Greek history is just the best. I mean, there's just such good records of all the things happening back then and the way that people thought and the problems that they faced. It's as relevant today when I read the stuff from ancient Greece that it could ever be. I mean, it just seems so relevant. And like guys like Marcus Aurelius and his writings, and his life was just such a tortured life. He had all these things, right? Yeah, he was the emperor, but had all kinds of crazy stuff. Family members trying to kill him, 18 years of war or whatever. He was out traveling around fighting, and this guy's writings are just incredible. And he had just some of the best teachers in human history that we have recordings of that were teaching him these things. And so some of Ryan Holiday's other books, like Stillness is the Key, is one that I really like. And then he's got his daily Stoic journal that he does, and it's like every day there's one Stoicism thought that you read, and they're short. They're like a page long, and you read them for 365 days and then try to practice it. But it's just, for people that don't know, it really is, I'll characterize it and you tell me if you think it's different, but it's kind of it's the joining of sort of the mindfulness camp. So stuff that you'll see in like traditional, kind of like the Buddha and like sort of this mindfulness, people that practice this being present. And then it's coupled that with this idea around, this kind of this just relentless focus on what you can control and sort of ruthlessly removing the thoughts and things from your life, from your mind and from your life of the things that you can't control. And if you can be present and focus on what you can control, it's like a superpower. And sounds cheesy, but man, it really has helped me. And I don't know how much you've, and I can talk about how it's helped me, but I want to get your thoughts on it.
Now, I've been a long time meditator, and I actually find that space before and after the emotion and the thought is probably the best reps you'll ever get. And Stoicism is an interesting realization that people have been the same for thousands of years and had the same problems and have gotten through things that are way worse than anything you're going to go through, and have survived and thrived in totally different environments, and done it in ways that they had meaning and purpose in their life. And so the question that I find so interesting, and you see it in Stockdale's writing too, and his life, like the benefit that the best stories weave people and experience into the lessons that are being taught. And so what I've enjoyed about Ryan's work is he does a lot of that as you described it, and so it makes it very readable and relatable. And it's a little bit of a Stoicism kind of got this tech-minded kind of West Coast trend of people looking for something to replace religion. I think. I don't think that it doesn't feel like it needs to be like that. The reality is that it's just, people have great examples of how and what you can do whenever you're interacting and feeling and thinking through things. And that first principle of taking a step back and realizing that, the emotion you're feeling will pass, and the thought you have may not, aren't always the best. But everybody that's gone through and had more power than either one of us ever will, from the influence of Marcus Aurelius to been weaker and in a worse health state, as like Admiral Stockdale whenever he was imprisoned. Like those thoughts are pretty powerful, and I think it matters. And so that we actually had Ryan come. I paid for him to come and talk to my group in Austin, because I really do think that reset of morality is something that a lot of society loses. And then I'm not saying I'm the most moral person or anything great, but it's what I'm trying to say is that the study of how people have lived and how they live, and applying just little bits of that to your own life will make it gradually better. And my grandpa used to say, every person you meet has something in them that's better than what's in you. So find that thing and emulate it. And so the thing that is, and it gets into like you're the combination of the 5 people you spend the most time with as well. And so try to make the people you spend your most time with good people. And so like try to find that glint in the eye of that little sparkle that is, meaningful and magical in every single person. And then, create that magic in yourself. And that's kind of where I take things. And that's how I think about, where life is and what the importance of it is. So enjoy yourself. You only have a certain amount of time. What is it? They call it the present because it's a gift. And so, unpack the gift every day and enjoy the rest of your Memorial Day, Max. It was good talking with you.
Yeah, it was good talking to you too. This is good stuff. All right, take it easy, Hike. I appreciate you hopping on today. We'll talk soon.
Bye, everybody.
All right, take it easy.